If the Chancellor needs to raise large sums, she could very straightforwardly do that with one of the big taxes. You can increase income tax by 1 percentage point and quickly you're getting more than 10 billion. You could freeze thresholds, and I wouldn't suggest she does that, but you could freeze the thresholds for 2 more years. That's also getting you over 10 billion. So you could quite quickly raise pretty large sums if you're willing to increase a tax on a big tax base, which basically means a tax on income or a tax on consumption. But if she wants to stick to those pledges, then I think things are more difficult. Hello and welcome to the IFS Zooms In. I'm Helen Miller, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Before we get into today's discussion, a quick reminder that on Tuesday, the 4th of November, we'll be recording an episode of this podcast in front of a live audience at the British Library. We'll be joined by our very own Stuart Adam and by Dan Needle, who is founder of Tax Policy Associates, to talk about all things tax and the budget, and in particular to look at the options the Chancellor faces if she decides to raise taxes in that budget. We'd love you to come along. You'll have a chance to ask us your questions, but spaces are limited, so before we tell the masses, please do grab your space now. Today, we are going to be talking about the public finances and the big picture choices that the Chancellor faces in the upcoming budget. In a nutshell, Rachel Reeves is in something of a fiscal Groundhog Day. Before the election, the Chancellor was very keen to stress that she didn't plan to raise taxes. Of course, then in her first budget, she did do a big tax rise, before stressing that she really didn't plan to come and do that again. It's now widely expected, however, that she will, in fact, raise taxes again. So why are we back in this situation? We at the IFS have just published new work as part of our annual Green Budget, looking at what's going on with tax revenue, spending and borrowing. And to give you the spoiler, we, like many others, think that Rachel Reeves is going to need to do a fiscal consolidation in the budget. That means cutting spending or raising taxes. That's effectively because, to a large degree, last year she chose to give herself a teeny-tiny headroom against her own borrowing rule and is now facing a downgrade to the outlook for growth. She'll need to take action to stick to her rule. So to pick through what's happening and what it all means, today I'm joined by my colleagues Carl Emmerson and Ben Zaranko. Hello, Carl and Ben. So shall we start with a brief reminder of what Rachel Reeves did at her first budget and kind of why we're back here? Rachel Reeves did a big tax rise. Although worth saying, she did overall a fiscal loosening. She borrowed more to invest. She has a borrowing rule, which means she wants revenues to be covering day-to-day spending in 2029-30. She was only just meeting that rule. That's the tiny headroom. And it was always completely possible that completely ordinary run-of-the-mill forecast changes would blow her off course. Since then, we've had reversals in cuts to social security spending, we've had higher interest rates, and now we're expecting a downgrade in productivity from the OBR. So that's why we are back where we are. Shall we start with that productivity downgrade and why we're expecting that to come?
I think a lot of the talk about the OBR is about how the forecasts turn out not to be correct. That's not surprising. Anyone that produces a forecast for how big the economy in 5 years' time is going to be must expect it not to be right. But if you look over the run of history since 2010, in terms of their medium-term forecasts, unfortunately, the OBR has tended to be over-optimistic about the size of the economy. And so what they've been doing in recent months is reviewing that record, looking at the evidence, and we don't know what they're going to do, but one suspects, and it's been widely reported, they'll say, yes, it does look like we've had a tendency to be over-optimistic over the medium term. And in particular, one of the key things in the forecast is how much you think people are going to be able to produce for each hour of work they do. That's a key determinant of living standards over the longer run. Other things matter too, like how many people are in work and how many hours they are working. But that productivity per hour is key. And they're going to forecast, we think, that it's going to grow over the next few years, but not as fast as they previously thought. That matters because it means a smaller economy, which means that a given tax system will collect less revenue for the Chancellor.
We don't know yet what the OBR will do. Most people expect they will downgrade productivity. And the question that we keep getting asked, Ben, is whose fault is that? And in particular, is it Nigel Farage's fault?
You probably get asked that more, Helen, because you're out talking to the media every day now, you're in your new flashy job. I think that it's worth casting our eyes back. As Carl alluded to, this isn't a new thing. The OBR has been sort of structurally optimistic, if you like, for a while. One just side point there is they're not just optimistic relative to the past, they're optimistic relative to other forecasters at the moment, which is not a good place for them to be. You don't want to be way outside of consensus, I don't think. So they're revisiting that assumption. And this is really best thought of as a structural UK problem. This is the UK struggling to return to the rates of productivity growth that we experienced pre-financial crisis, and then subsequently even struggling to meet the rates that we were forecasting post that, and then things sort of sputtering along. Of late, the economy overall has been growing at a reasonably okay rate, but mainly because of population growth driven itself by inwards migration and GDP per head not doing so well. And we need to get what underlying causes are. Now, there's, because of stories in the press, an expectation that Rachel Reeves is going to say it's Nigel Farage's fault, as you say. Basically, this is a result of Brexit undermining the UK's growth potential, making us all worse off. So a few things. Yes, the consensus of the economics profession is that Brexit will make the UK poorer. I think there's lots of numbers floating around, but something like 3 to 4% smaller economy than we might have otherwise had. That will be feeding through gradually over time. It's quite hard to pinpoint exact numbers here, not least because the moment we left the EU properly, a big bloody pandemic came along and skewed all the economic numbers, making it very difficult to identify separate things. But we should expect the economy to be smaller. That will be feeding through gradually. One reason why we've had poor growth in the last few years may well be, and probably is to some degree, because of Brexit. So she's not completely wide of the mark. There's also some other factors going on. This is a global story. This isn't just a UK story. There are UK-specific angles, of course. But I think that to blame it all on Nigel Farage might be a bit rich. And I think the key thing is that this shouldn't be coming out of the blue. We can come back to this, but this isn't a complete shock. This isn't something that's only emerged as a problem in the last 12 months. This is a much longer running, widely expected productivity downgrade that Rachel Reeves will be grappling with.
And that's really important here, right? So, it is worth emphasising we have got a long run problem here. Productivity growth has been weak for a while. I think Rachel Reeves can rightly cite that she had an absolutely dire inheritance. It was a really tough time to be Chancellor. And some of this downgrade might be reflecting that the OBR has been optimistic for a while because of things that happened in the past. What she absolutely can't credibly claim is that she couldn't have seen anything like this coming. I mean, we at the IFS were talking about this loudly and clearly before the election, saying that things like OBR was more optimistic on growth than other forecasters, saying that things can get better as well as worse. So, if we think about why at this particular moment in time, why is the Chancellor looking towards needing to do a fiscal consolidation? I think that you can really trace back quite largely to the choice she made last budget over giving herself this kind of teeny tiny headroom. Of course, no one wants to be the Chancellor holding the fiscal public finances when a downgrade hits. And maybe she didn't know exactly how the world was going to turn out. We wouldn't know exactly how trade would turn out. But the idea that something would come along and something would happen, you should have known that was very possible. And actually, I guess one measure of that is the kind of consolidation we're talking about. Maybe we'll come on to the numbers here, but we're not talking about the OBR doing something that is historically completely out of whack. Right? We're talking about actually something very relatively ordinary and run-of-the-mill could be what Rachel Reeves needs to be responding to.
Yeah, I think the tax rise we saw in her first budget perhaps wasn't such a surprise either. We often see the first budget of a parliament containing a big tax rise, and it's often even bigger if it's a chancellor of a different colour to the previous chancellor. So switch from Conservative to Labour, perhaps not surprising, you end up with a tax rise. What was, I think, surprising about that first budget is that normally the first budget in a parliament, you see a big fiscal tightening. That's not what we saw. We saw a big fiscal loosening. Day-to-day spending was topped up by a bit more than the tax rise. So she weakened the current budget position, and for good reasons, but she also chose to top up the investment spending plans considerably too, therefore planning to borrow a lot more money. I guess if there is a productivity downgrade in this budget, as we expect, I guess where she's been unlucky is the sense that, she would much rather if it had come before the election. It would have then been perhaps partly seen to be Jeremy Hunt's problem, her predecessor, or alternatively, she'd probably rather it came in the run-up to her first budget, because then she could have dealt with that in the round. So she's probably a little bit unlucky in the timing. Not saying this is anyone's fault, but probably a bit unlucky that it's come in her second budget. That also has implications for how we play things out, because it's happening after she's already, for example, concluding a multi-year spending review. Had the downgrade happened before last year's budget, maybe there'd been different decisions made in that spending review.
Yeah, I think Carl's definitely right that the path dependency matters here. But another aspect of that is, why is Rachel Reeves operating with such minimal headroom? I hate using the word, but let's just do it for shorthand. Partly because that's what she inherited from her predecessor, right? It was Jeremy Hunt who was the first person to choose to have these pass-fail rules and choose to meet them by roughly £10 billion. And that was what he bequeathed to Rachel Reeves. And so if you start from a position of having a 40 billion buffer and you choose to run it down to 10, that's wildly irresponsible. Starting with a buffer of 10 billion, choosing to stick with it, I think is irresponsible, but it's not quite so bad. I have at least some sympathy with the idea that doing an additional 30 billion tightening on top of that first budget just to rebuild the buffer would have been politically difficult. But then, she's made her bed, she has to lie in it. And on this, I think that the best analogy I've heard on this question so far is from Andrew Balls at PIMCO, who said, basically, if you want to drive 50 miles, don't put 50 miles of petrol in the car. And I think that's great, and I wish we'd come up with that. But I wanted to try another one out on you two. So, it's often said that, when the American economy sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. But we've now got a situation where if the American economy, clears its throat energetically, the UK Chancellor has to go running straight off to the pharmacy. And we're just left so exposed, and we're left, flailing around between budgets, limping along, subject to constant speculation. And I think the Chancellor does need to bear some responsibility for that.
Yeah, and maybe it's worth spelling out why we think it's costly to have this speculation, right? Because we're not saying that chancellors shouldn't ever change policy, and that's why they have budgets. But the fact that we've had all this speculation over summer about tax rises both means that individuals have been changing their behaviour or trying to guess what the Chancellor is going to do. Side point that it's made worse by the fact that Rachel Reeves tied her hands so much on tax measures in the manifestos. Had we been in a more normal world where actually all of the tax raising options were still on the table, I think we'd have seen less speculation about itty-bitty little bits of tax being changed. So it's a combination of that low headroom in an uncertain world with these big tax locks. So it's directly damaging to economic activity. It is also just sucking the life out of other kinds of debates and taking up a lot of brain power. Right, people in the government are now thinking about how to navigate the politics of this budget, and not about not as much as they could be about other questions like how to drive up growth or make public services more efficient, or how to do the things that would really get us out of the public finance problem and make it better. So I think there is really a cost to this approach of just limping from budget to budget.
Right. I don't think the point, we're not trying to say that the government should never respond to changes in the forecast, right? If we think we're going to be permanently poorer because our scope for productivity growth is just weaker, that's the sort of thing you probably should adjust to. But the question is whether we should be doing this twice a year, whether we should be doing it in a rushed fashion in that sort of 10-week pre-budget window when the forecast's still moving around, whether it should be taking up so much bandwidth at the centre. And whether that volatility itself causes damage, but the uncertainty that comes with it, I think, puts off investment decisions and so on in companies. And it's, can we get out of this cycle? Not to say we should never be adjusting policy, because obviously we should be adjusting policy, but how often and in response to what, and with what degree of precision? Because we're chasing a moving target. It's trying to pinpoint something relative to something else that's much bigger in several years' time in a world where no one even knows what American tariffs on China are going to look like next week. And just trying to fine-tune things to that degree is just a waste of time and effort, I think.
Actually, on that, since you've had a new analogy, here's a new analogy from me, because I've been thinking a lot recently about how to explain just how small the headroom is, because I think to most people 10 billion sounds like a really big number, and of course it is a really big number. But I think that is the kind of analogous to saying, I want you to estimate what your house is worth in 3 or 4 or 5 years' time, and you think it's roughly £300,000, but I want you to estimate it within £1,000. I want you to be within £1,000 sure that you've got the right number. Nobody thinks that's realistic, right? I mean, we're asking for an unreasonable degree of precision in some of these forecasts, and expecting to be able to forecast this like 2 point something trillion pounds economy, with narrow bands that we just aren't realistic.
I think that's all correct, but I do think that doesn't mean you should just say, oh, there's lots of red ink in my forecast, therefore I'm just going to borrow more because it will probably be all right. Or, the OBR are independent experts appointed to try and produce a central forecast. That means that there's a 50% chance, a pretty big chance, things will be better than what they expect, and let's hope that's the case. Unfortunately, it also means there's a 50% chance that things will be worse. So we have a pretty poor map. We don't know what the equivalent of the house will be worth in 4 years' time. We have a best guess. And I think we have to be careful about thinking, politically motivated wishful thinking. That's what we need to be careful of. And I think also, she's got choices in the forthcoming budget. She could choose to up taxes. She could choose to cut spending. She could choose to try and borrow more. But I do think the case for trying to permanently borrow more is pretty weak, given that there's nothing really special about these fiscal rules, but they're pretty loose. And bond markets are pretty volatile. So people who are lending the government money, they're choosing to do that, are probably happy to lend the government a bit more if it wants, but the price for doing so could be higher, and it's already pretty expensive. So I think the case for permanently borrowing more, or planning to permanently borrow more, I should say, is actually pretty weak.
I think I'd be even stronger than that. I think it's extremely, extremely weak. I mean, this is not some kind of temporary thing we think we'll get through. If the OBR hands her a permanently downgraded set of forecasts and says that we think, day-to-day spending will be running ahead of revenues, that's exactly what Rachel Reeves said she didn't want to do. That's exactly her iron-clad fiscal rule. So I would be very, very surprised if she chose to break them. You're right, she could, but I'd be surprised if that's where she went.
As much as anything else, is whether if she chose to borrow an extra $5 billion, and that meant she pushed slightly over one of these bright lines, the extra $5 billion itself isn't that big. The point is more, and we might come back to this, so what signal does that send to people who are not just thinking about the next few months, they're thinking about lending to the government on a longer term basis? What signal does that send about the government's willingness to confront difficult decisions? What does it mean about how seriously they take fiscal discipline? How seriously do they take, all these commitments they've made on the basis of which people lend the government money? And I think that the signal really is more important often than the precise numbers and precise measures involved.
It's also worth reminding people that, governments for a long time now have had these plans to get borrowing down, to get debt down, and they haven't actually pulled it off, right? So, and although it doesn't feel like good times now, we are in relatively good times relative to some recent, circumstances. And this is the time when you don't want to be ratcheting debt up more than you need to be. You want to be trying to get that down and make some space for when something bad is going to happen. We don't know what it is yet, but something will happen in the world. We will want to be able to respond to that. We have to leave ourselves some ability to respond in the future.
Worth saying that the projected borrowing for the UK, it is set to come down based on the plans that Rachel Reeves has set out. And that's not true in lots of other comparable countries, or certainly not true to the same extent. We're actually planning a bigger consolidation than lots of other countries are. So, this is one of the points that our friends at Barclays made in the Green Budget this year, is actually look at the fundamentals. The UK doesn't look like that much of an outlier, and actually looks relatively well behaved if you compare us to the naughty kids in France, for example. And so, I can see how eventually that might come to be rewarded by those who lend us money.
So talk about debt, though, before we get on to what Rachel Reeves will actually do in the budget, because I think debt's an interesting one here. I mean, for years, kind of debt was the sort of the binding constraint in some sense. We worried a lot about getting debt down. Rachel Reeves has had a new measure of debt that she is targeting and that allowed her to do more borrowing. And this time last year, we were talking about how it's her borrowing rule that is binding. It's the need to get revenues matching at least day-to-day spending. But actually, it could very well be the case that the debt rule comes back to bite pretty quickly, and that you can't be running deficits anymore and still getting the debt down.
It could be. I mean, she's got her first rule, this borrowing rule that says she's got to be on course to have more revenue than she's spending on day-to-day things. We think that she's going to need to do some tightening to be in compliance with that. Her second rule says that she needs to be on course to have her preferred measure of debt falling as a share of national income, again in 29-30. And at the time of the March spring forecast, that measure of debt was falling a bit faster as a share of national income, whereas so she had a bit more headroom against that. It's really quite hard to forecast that headroom. That rule is really difficult to predict because it depends a lot on how fast you think the economy is going to grow by in the fifth year of the forecast. That really matters. So it could be that there's a lot more headroom against that rule and it's just the borrowing one she's got to worry about. But it could easily be that the debt rule becomes more of the problem. That's what it looks like in our own numbers that we've produced in the Green Budget that's just come out. So that means you may even need to do a bit of a bigger fiscal tightening. Now, to meet that debt rule, other things come into play. You could, for example, cut back on your planned investment spending, or, because the rule's pretty odd, you could just reprofile some of your investment spending, do it earlier, not later, makes it easier to meet that rule. That's how silly it is. But it could well be that some attention kind of needs to be played to that one. The reason I'm struggling a bit with it is it's really not a very good rule. You're probably better off changing that rule to something that's more meaningful rather than trying to fine tune against it.
Yeah, well, the good news or the bad news, depending on your perspective, is that we might end up talking a lot more about that particular measure of debt she's chosen, public sector net financial liabilities. You might get to the world where Rachel Reeves is using the word persnuffle in the House of Commons, which is something we're slowly working towards. There are lots of options that opens up, though, whether it's to do with government financial transactions and the timing of those and the structure of those, whether it's capital spending, which can be these multi-year projects. Maybe you shift some of it around. Probably doesn't lend itself to fantastic project planning, but is at least more options on the table. I suppose just the key point is we've been doing lots of focus on the borrowing rule of late, but the debt rule might be making a big comeback.
And it's a reminder that, the underlying problem we have in all of this is weak economic growth, and that just makes the debt harder to manage, because it used to be the case that you had a big nominal stock of debt. Higher growth basically helps make that smaller. And when you haven't got that strong growth, that big stock of debt just sits there and has a high interest bill attached to it. So that is a problem that's that we're going to be seeing for many years, I expect. Okay, but let's go on to what Rachel Reeves might actually do in the budget in terms of the big choices she faces. So we say we don't yet know what the OBR will hand her in terms of their final forecast, but we expect, and it is widely expected, that she will need to do a fiscal consolidation. We don't think she'll break her fiscal rules, and therefore the first big choice she has is, for any fiscal consolidation, how to share that between cutting spending and raising taxes.
I mean, in terms of the size of the consolidation, our central numbers suggest that, yes, she starts with 10 billion of headroom, teeny amount of headroom. We know that she's lost 6 billion of that because of the decisions to expand the winter fuel payments to pensioners, reversing a decision that was made for last winter, and not to go ahead with some reforms to working age disability benefits. We know that she's lost about £5 billion because it now looks like interest rates are going to be higher than they were at the time of the March budget. So that already puts her in negative territory. Based on Barclays' central estimates, we think she might be losing another £9-10 billion or so because of that downgrade in productivity growth. The OBR might well pick a different number, but it shouldn't be surprising if she's looking at 20 billion plus of consolidation if she wants to get back to the kind of headroom she had back in March.
So then the question is, how do you find that, right? 20 could be bigger, more than 20, doesn't even factor in things like a potential freeze in fuel duty. There's another 3 billion or so if you do it for 1 year. Reversing the 2-child limit, that could be another couple of billion. You could easily be looking at 30 plus as well, depending on the precise forecasting judgments here. How do you find that amount? So let's do spending first. Could you cut 30 billion from public spending? Yes. We spend like 1,200 billion or something every year. Could you find 30 from that? Sure. Can you do that readily and simply? No. I think the reasons why that is the case are twofold. One, welfare is a big chunk of government spending. And the key thing, if the government's going to be pursuing spending cuts, is can it do so in a credible way? Can it be confident they're deliverable? Can it be confident that those invest in government bonds, and also the wonks at the OBR will view it as credible? And there's not much parliamentary support, I gather, for cuts to welfare, whether that be for working age people, whether that be for children, whether that be for pensioners. Doesn't seem there's a huge constituency for that in UK politics. So it's a question of, can you actually pass the bill?
Well, there are big spending increases there. So if you could find I agree, it seems unlikely, but if you could find the political will to reform and or cut some of those areas, it's areas where the state, like disability being the obvious one, where the state is growing very quickly. So you'd have to hold it back just to stop it growing. So there is
right, and though spending on things like working age, health-related benefits is growing very quickly. Spending on support for children with disabilities is growing very quickly. Spending on support for children with special educational needs is growing very quickly. Could we find a way to make that grow more slowly, or just hold roughly where it is now? If we could, through meaningful reform to those systems, to entitlements, to eligibility, could be to payment rates, or maybe replacing some forms of provision with cheaper, more cost-effective means of provision. Could we? Yeah, of course we could find savings, but that is a careful, delicate exercise affecting some very vulnerable people that you want to do for ideally principled reasons, not just to try and make the numbers in the spreadsheet add up, but you absolutely could pursue savings there. Are they going to do it in time for this budget? I have some doubts, but maybe. Then you've got the other big chunk, which is departmental spending, where at the spending review in June, detailed settlements for the Home Office, for the NHS, for schools, for courts and so on, were all set out in detail up to 2028-29. They've been told, go away, deliver all these ambitious service improvements that we've asked of you with those budgets. To unpick those after a few months would hardly lend itself to effective planning. I can imagine tearing my hair out if I was a prison warden or a head teacher being told, hang on, I thought I had this much money and now you're telling me I've got less. So that would be disruptive. Now, she could say, okay, we'll give you the money for the next couple of years, but actually in 2029-30, I've decided I need to save some cash. So she could pencil in a less generous overall settlement. She wouldn't have to specify where the cuts are going to fall. That's something some of her predecessors were very adept at doing.
I think it's fair to say we would describe that as not very credible.
Well, quite. And it doesn't really matter what we think, Carl. But what does matter is if she said that, she said, I'm going to save £10 billion. I'm not going to tell you where it's going to come from. We might,
or indeed deliver it for 4.5 years.
We would have our heads in our hands.
Yeah, we get some podcast content out of it though. But the key point is that bond investors might view that as not a serious attempt to deal with the problem. And I think perhaps more pressingly for the Chancellor, the OBR are now allowed to forecast overspends as well as underspends. That's quite a new thing, something I haven't made much use of yet. But if the Chancellor starts penciling in very, very tight numbers for later in the Parliament with no real sense of how they're going to be achieved, I would be surprised if the OBR actually just plugged those numbers in and said, okay, great. So even if you plugged in a 10 billion cut, it's not obvious that would show up in the official central forecast. So spending, of course, there are meaningful ways to reform spending and save money. I think the three big questions I would be putting to anyone, any party seeking to make big spending cuts is, one, what do we currently do that we're going to stop doing? That could be we're going to no longer provide childcare subsidies to working parents because we decide we don't need that extra bit of the welfare state, though people seem quite fond of that as far as I can tell, particularly the young parents in this building. The second one is, what do we currently provide for free that we could start charging for? So, currently you go to sixth form for free. We could say, actually, you have to take out a loan for that. Post-16 education, guys, sorry. Or what do we currently provide university that we're going to start means testing? Like winter fuel payments, for example, which we are, to be fair, means testing, just not as harshly as the government originally intended. But you could also think about some services that you might start to limit access to. Without engaging with those sorts of questions, I just fail to see how we can save really meaningful money. Of course, we should be aiming to be more efficient and more productive. Of course, we can think about how best to structure things like our system of disability benefit support. But I don't detect a great deal of seriousness among those calling for tens of billions of pounds of spending cuts and actually engaging with how hard that would be.
It's also worth reminding people that, we talked about this in the podcast a few weeks ago, the numbers already assume some pretty punchy increases in public sector productivity. So the government has to just deliver on those just to meet with the current set of forecasts. If they under-deliver on that, and that is possible because we are trying to do something we haven't done for a long time, that would actually push up on spending. So you shouldn't just think, just be a bit more productive, we'll just write some more there. I mean, we could be more productive, but we are already trying quite hard to do that.
There's one area of government where they have made a very deliberate choice to cut, and that is spending on overseas aid, where spending this year set to be 0.5% of national income. That's going to be cut to 0.3% of national income. So that is a 40% cut from one year to the next. I think that is a big cut by anyone's measure. That is a choice that has been made. And I think it's also a manifesto break. So it's interesting when we talk about some manifesto pledges as being perhaps not breakable. Other ones seem a little bit more flexible. So in some cases, the government has made a clear choice. And given at IFS, we're always calling for them to be clear about, what you want to spend money on and to prioritise. In that case, they have chosen to deprioritise one area of spending.
But that was an interesting one, wasn't it? Because it was announced alongside a matching increase in defence spending. So it's going to spend less on aid and spend more on defence, and it's the changing role of Britain in the world type thing. That was a reasonable way of doing it. I mean, some people disagree with it, but it was reasonable. I know the Conservatives want to go all the way down to 0.1% of GDP on aid, which might get to the point where it's difficult to reconcile that with our amount we spent on global vaccine programs and the World Bank and the UN and stuff like that.
Or indeed supporting asylum seekers in the UK.
Which to be fair to them, they also want to cut. But yes, that was one clear choice. And that was actually quite a reasonably rare in UK politics occasion of a government standing up and go, yes, actually, we want to do this. And that means, unfortunately, we're going to have to do less of that, which was, coherent. More of that, I suppose, please.
So, of course, there's no law of nature that means we can't cut, or the government can't cut spending. But for all the reasons we just highlighted, I think it's why most people expect we will see at least some degree of tax rises in the budget. And again, how big they are depends on how much Rachel Reeves chooses to do. And then we talked a lot about tax in general in life, but in the last...
You especially.
Me especially, yeah, in the last few days. I mean, a few things I'd pull out from that is that, again, Rachel Reeves has these tax locks in the manifesto, which are very, very constraining. Now, again, there's obviously some flexibility there because the last budget completely broke one of the manifesto's pledges by increasing employer national insurance contributions. That's a very straightforward breach in my mind, and the basis that it is an increase in national insurance contributions, and the manifesto says I won't increase national insurance contributions. It's nothing to do with the funny working person pledge and whatever that happens to mean. So if the Chancellor wants to raise large sums, she could very straightforwardly do that with one of the big taxes. You can increase income tax by 1 percentage point, and quickly you're getting more than 10 billion. You could freeze thresholds, and I wouldn't suggest she does that, but you could freeze the thresholds for 2 more years. That's also getting you over 10 billion. So you could quite quickly raise pretty large sums if you're willing to increase a tax on a big tax base, which basically means a tax on income or a tax on consumption. But if she wants to stick to those pledges, then I think things are more difficult. And they're more difficult because not only are the top 3 taxes pretty constrained, but actually the next 4 for various reasons. So corporation tax, business rates, council tax, fuel duty are all constrained for different reasons. I mean, with corporation tax and business rates, she's basically ruled out large tax increases. There are pledges there. Council tax is already due to go up by something like 4.3% each year in the forecast. So you'd need to go above and beyond that to raise new revenue. And tax and fuel duty in the forecast is expected to go up in line with inflation. And no Chancellor has yet pulled that off. So the danger there is that not only will she not raise more money, she won't even get the money she's currently got penciled in.
And there's a 5p
cut.
Temporary cut to
There's
fuel
temporary
duty
cut.
that won't be temporary.
Exactly. So, and once you're outside of those top 7 taxes, you really are into the small taxes of, the sin taxes, the capital taxes. And there's absolutely more you could do there. You can do lots of things to lots of small taxes and you can raise chunky sums. But I think if she were thinking of if Rachel Reeves were thinking of something that's like multiple tens of billions, so close to 30, then something like 20, I think it's very hard to see how you would actually raise enough money by just touching small tax. And I can't resist the urge to say, because I say it on everything about tax, she really shouldn't just be thinking about the politics of navigating kind of what she can get away with. She absolutely should also be thinking about the kind of economics, because tax rises are not all born equal. Some of them are particularly damaging to growth. And there's opportunity here that she could really reform taxes, right? She could make the system better. But if she doesn't, then I think it's a risk that she might do lots of little things and make growth worse.
I mean, to give people a sense of scale, if she did want to do a £30 billion tax rise, well, there's about 30 million households roughly in the UK. So you're talking about £1,000 per year per household on average. Now, there's no way there's going to be a tax rise that hits everyone the same. But of course, the more you focus out on a select group of households, perhaps higher income or higher wealth ones, the bigger the hit for them, the more the risk they change their behaviour. I think it's also worth saying that if she did go for a £30 billion tax rise, that's quite a big tax rise. It's not huge by some of the big tax raising budgets. For example, it'll be, probably not as big as we saw last year. It's sort of comparable too. So it wouldn't be perhaps, it wouldn't be an outlier in the sense of, it would be up there, but not the biggest tax raising budget we have seen.
Shall we park tax and say, if you want to hear more about all the specifics and see Helen do her big tax reform plea in the flesh, you can come along to our live podcast in a few weeks' time.
Yeah, absolutely. So one choice is clearly about how to split any consolidation between tax and spend, and which things to increase taxes or cut spending on. Let's come back to this kind of like the size of the consolidation, because we started talking about the headroom earlier. I mean, Rachel Reeves made a choice last year to operate with very, very small headroom. She could come back and make the same choice this year, or even reduce headroom in principle, or she could increase her headroom. And I think we think there's a pretty strong case for doing that, because for all the reasons we talked about earlier, not having headroom against these bright line pass-fails rules is causing lots of uncertainty and speculation that is damaging. So, of course, building more headroom would come with a real cost. You have to raise taxes by more or cut spending by more. So it's a political choice whether you want to do that. But it is a choice at the budget over how big a size of the consolidation to do.
And it comes with the benefit that it makes it less likely that next spring or next autumn you have to stand up and do more. And so therefore that's a political benefit because presumably she's not going to want to do another fiscal tightening in 2026. But it also has an economic benefit because as long as it looks like her fiscal rules are on course to be met, there'll be less speculation in the run-up to any fiscal event saying, oh, is Rachel Reeves going to put up this tax or that tax, creating uncertainty for taxpayers, possibly leading some taxpayers to change their behaviour in damaging ways in the run-up to a fiscal event, and also meaning that people like us, people at the Treasury, are busily trying to think about what tax rise might we do or how would we design one quickly rather than thinking about the longer term and what we'd rather focus on.
To go back to the car analogy that I've become quite fond of, is Rachel Reeves basically put 51 miles worth of petrol in her car and she's got to go 50 miles. Now, adding an extra 5 litres of petrol isn't cost free. You got to go and pay the attendant and accidentally buy a Kit Kat on the way. That always happens to me. But she would benefit at least from then being pretty certain she's going to get where she wants to go. She's not going to find herself having to pull in again at the petrol station in a few miles' time with her crying kids in the back. I'm really pushing this now. But the point is that it's not costless to increase headroom, but it's not costless to limp from event to event with constant speculation and about what you're going to do and what taxes you're going to increase. Policy uncertainty and volatility is bad. I think she knows that, right? Because if you actually go back and read, in particular, the May's lecture that Rachel Reeves gave pre-election in 2024, she talks a lot about the value of policy stability and it being sort of one of the things she views as underpinning growth along with it. It's quite a thoughtful speech. But then we've just ended up with the opposite. We've designed a system and operated it in such a way that we get the opposite of policy stability. And I think, I think she made some comment this morning in the press about, I want to break out of this cycle. And, there's hints that she might be, thinking seriously about whether she should be increasing headroom. And I think there'd be a very good case for doing so. I think it probably depends to a large extent what the OBR say. If the OBR, it's crazy that we depend so much on precisely what the OBR say anyway, but if the OBR say, we're downgrading by 10 billion, maybe she goes, okay, I'm going to tighten by 25 and increase by 15 billion. But if the OBR say, we're downgrading by 25, she then has to go, okay, I'm doing a tightening of 40 billion. And suddenly that just starts to get trickier, certainly trickier to reconcile with the manifesto promises. So there's a lot of moving parts here, but I hope when it all settles, we can break out of this unhelpful equilibrium and get that petrol tank nice and full.
Yeah, anyone's agree with that. Of course, the other thing that's been mooted and talked about in this sort of spirit of removing policy volatility is just scrapping the second OBR forecast. So we should talk about, Ben and I look forward to talking about this. We should talk about that. So, there is I think most people think that having only one proper fiscal event every year is a good idea.
Yeah.
For all sorts of reasons, you shouldn't need to be fine-tuning and tweaking everything every 6 months. So I think we're all on board with just have one fiscal event every year, please. The UK currently has a second fiscal forecast and has had done so for over 50 years.
Since 1975.
But there is an argument that says, why don't you just scrap that? And if there's no fiscal forecast, your rules aren't being judged, you can't change any policies. That just immediately takes away policy volatility. What do you think, Ben?
I do understand the case, right? I think we should try and engender some disagreement on this podcast. We always just agree with each other. I can see the case, at least, for it being simple and it being a sort of maybe a pragmatic, hard-headed look and saying, look, even if we design some clever mechanism to ease out some of these issues, which we come back to, such as using some sort of range or whatever else, saying, I can't realistically do an extra 15 billion of tax rises. I have nothing to show for it, or 20 billion or 30 billion or whatever. That's just politically impossible. And the British media and British politics can't be grown up enough to look through these things and to ignore these things and not to ceaselessly speculate about these things. And that's unhelpful. And so it's not where I'd like to be, but the simplest thing is just for me to scrap the spring forecast altogether. Therefore, there's no way I can adjust policy because there's no fiscal event or forecast for me to be adjusting in response to. That's the best case of the argument, I think. And I think that's where thoughtful people think that. So like Chris Giles at the FT, for example, that's basically what Chris thinks. I hope if he listens, I hope he doesn't think I've completely misrepresented him there. But I just think it would be a real shame because we've managed 50 years of doing 2 forecasts a year. And we should reflect on why it is that only now is it becoming such a big problem. And so much of this stems from that policy choice to have everything ride on a single forecast, produced by the OBR and then aim to meet it almost exactly, meaning that literally anything, anywhere can blow us off course.
It's not just the UK for the last 50 years. It's also the case that other advanced economies tend to produce 2 forecasts a year. The IMF see it as best practice. I don't think we have an economic theory or study that says every 26 weeks is exactly how frequent you want to produce your forecasts. But I would be, if I was advising, I hope maybe the Chancellor's listening now, but I would be very nervous about saying I'm going to produce an official economic and fiscal forecast half as often as I used to, because I think people might think you're doing that for reasons of trying to be a little bit looser with your fiscal rules and a bit less serious about keeping the public finances in a good state. I would really worry about how you land that with the people who are lending the government money and say, well, it's all okay. I'm just going to let you see the numbers once a year rather than twice a year, even though all of my predecessors since 1975 have chosen to do it twice a year.
Okay, here's a question. What if she combines it with an increase in headroom and something that's credibility enhancing and sends a signal that she's really wants to get to grips with some of these pressures? Maybe she says, I'm going to do a big official review of the triple lock, and Carl Emmerson's heading it. And she says, I'm going to, she does a credible package of tax rise and she builds in more headroom, but she says, I've done all that, but I'm also scrapping the second forecast because it's just more trouble than it's worth. There's plenty of other forecasts out there, and maybe it's not needed. I agree with you. It hardly sends a signal of strength, right? It hardly looks like a signal of fiscal strength. But maybe in combination with other things, maybe it's not a complete disaster. It means we can have a bit of a quieter March and April every year.
No, we won't, because everyone will ask us what we think is going to happen. I think I'm a bit tougher on this than you guys. I think it would be the wrong move. I think it would be a show of, like, a sign of weakness rather than a sign of strength. It would be a massive blow to fiscal transparency. And it's not just that you're removing the information from the kind of broader public debate, and people like us could step in and sort of fill that gap in some sense. You're taking information away from Parliament. You are kind of ruling out the idea that you would ever want to tweak policy in a spring forecast. Look, I think we in most normal times we want one event per year. Do I think it's never ever the case that you want a second event? No, I think there might be something that happened in the world, that a shock came along.
Yeah, you might ask them to do another one,
but then you have to do something extraordinary and out of the what.
I think that's a really good point. I think when the financial crisis hit, I think the then Labour government found it very useful to have an autumn statement in November. The timing was perhaps a little bit lucky in the sense that banks started going down, or American banks started going down in October, but it meant that they got to do something without an extraordinary fiscal event, things that we became used to during the pandemic, actually. And if you take the policy, monetary policy equivalent, the MPC of the Bank of England meets every month. They don't tend to change interest rates every month. I think many months they just say no change. But maybe it's useful to have that in the diary so they don't have to organise an extraordinary meeting with the signal that might send.
I mean, for the MPC, for the best part of a decade, we thought they'd forgotten how to change interest rates. But
I think I have a problem with it both on the basis that I think it would be bad for transparency. It would take information out of the debate. It would sort of limit choices in a way that I think is too extreme. It's too much like baby with the bathwater. I'm also not sure the benefits are actually that great, in the sense that you could still be in fiscal Groundhog Day this time next year in the next budget, because things can move against you. You don't necessarily stop speculation, because other people will work out forecasts. If there had been something big happening, then people will know that something's coming and you're still going to get the speculation. So I sort of think it's actually a very costly measure that doesn't actually get you that much in return. So I don't think there's no case for it. I think you're right, but I think you can make a case for it. I just don't think the case is very strong. And more importantly, I think there's something else they could try first, which is this range that they've already got on legislated for. I'm going to let you explain this, Carl. So the government have already said they wanted to operate with a range, and they could bring that forward.
So the Treasury's plan is that in each autumn budget, they want to make sure they're on course for a current budget balance or surplus by the third year of the forecast horizon. But they want to move to a world where when they produce their spring forecast, that second forecast a year, it's okay as long as the current budget's not forecast to be in deficit by more than 0.5% of GDP, about £15 billion or so. So the idea is that a spring forecast, the Chancellor could say, yes, I'm forecast to be in a modest deficit 3 years out. That's still consistent with my fiscal rules. As long as that doesn't get revised away, I will have to take action against it in the autumn, but I don't need to do an adjustment now.
We shouldn't get too bogged down on the specifics of this. I think there's a lot to commend something like that, or there's other complicated ways to sort of resolve this tension between 2 forecasts a year and 1 fiscal event. It's just that, are these things are they difficult to explain? They might require changes to legislation. Would it be interpreted correctly by the media and by markets? Go into this. We have a full podcast on ranges for the fiscal rules, so I suspect Alex, our producer, it will stop us from doing so. But it's an important issue, but it's hard to do justice in a few minutes.
Yeah, so we wrap up because we're near the end, but I think the important point is that before we throw out the baby with the bathwater on the second forecast, there are other things that the government could do to stop the policy volatility. The most straightforward thing to do would just be to operate with more headroom. We're in this situation because of that initial choice. And if you aren't going to do that, you kind of are in the world of second best, because you're expecting normal forecast changes to be blowing you off course. So you have to do something that's kind of not necessarily a first best.
Yeah, put more petrol in the car.
More petrol in the car. Okay. I think if there was a theme that I would draw out of all of this discussion, is that Rachel Reeves has choices. She's not just a victim of external circumstances or constraints. She made an important choice last year to operate with very little headroom against her fiscal rules, and that is to a large degree why we're back in what I've been dubbing fiscal Groundhog Day, looking again at tax rises. Not to say she didn't have a dire inheritance. She did. We've had a long-running problem with growth in this country, but it really was that choice about headroom that means that she has to make an adjustment at this particular point in time. We've basically highlighted 3 big picture choices that she has in this budget. The first is over whether to do any fiscal consolidation that she wants through tax rises and or spending cuts. I think most importantly, there's not one right way of doing that. But there are worse options and bad ways to do it. Whatever she does, it absolutely has to be credible, and including credible so that the people who are lending the government money are willing to keep lending without putting the price of that lending up. The other choice is about the size of the consolidation, where we've said there's a strong case for building up some more headroom against those fiscal rules. That is not costless. It would mean doing a bigger tax rise than otherwise, for example. But the constant speculation is also not costless. It directly damages economic activity, and it just sucks the energy and time out of other important debates like how we can get growth up and effectively deliver public services. And then finally, she faces the choice we've been discussing about the fiscal framework and whether to scrap that second forecast. I don't think she should scrap the second forecast. I think it would be throwing out the baby with the bathwater. I think it would be going against best practice. It would be terrible for transparency, removing information from the debate. I think it could make the government look weaker rather than stronger. So I hope they find better choices to get rid of what we all agree is a problem of this policy volatility. But for now, thank you, Ben, thank you, Carl, and thank you all for listening. I should also say thank you to the Nuffield Foundation and to Barclays, who have provided the funding that have made this year's Green Budget possible. And there are a ton of resources now, a ton of Green Budget outputs on our website, so you can find the link for those in the episode description. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do subscribe to the IFS Zooms In your podcast app and share it with anyone you might think is interested. And if you'd like to be one of the lovely people who support our work, you can become a member for as little as £10 a month. So do please check the link in the episode description, and we'll see you next time.